I'm super excited to share this conversation with you. It's from a leader I deeply admire. I've had the pleasure of working with Peter Harmer while he was the CEO at IAG and saw firsthand just how he was able to conduct himself and run such an amazing organization. Peter is purposeful. He now sits on the board of the Commonwealth Bank, NIB, and another couple of other major companies. Look, his ability to present calmness in the face of pressure. And his incredible insights will really serve us all well if we can take these lessons on board. He's an incredibly insightful man, and there's definitely levels of learning here for anyone who's a student of leadership. Peter's incredibly generous and humble in this conversation, and I really hope you can soak up all of that. Let me please introduce you to the wonderful Peter Harmer. Peter, thank you so much for making some time to have a chat. I know you've got a lot on your plate, and it's really good to be able to chat to you. So, welcome, and thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks, Daniel. I'm thrilled to be able to be a part of your series. I've followed your work fairly closely since you left IAG, and congratulations on fulfilling a really important service to the business community and I think to the community more broadly.
Thank you so much. Look, let's start by just a bit about your journey. Your role, some of the roles in your leadership journey. Maybe even the first sort of time you stepped into that leadership space.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I had a very short stint in the Army, cut short by health. But when I came out of the Army, I joined an insurance company, and I spent the first 8 years across two insurance companies. And that's sort of when I sort of feel like I built the technical foundations that sort of helped me figure out what the right questions might be to ask sort of down the track. My first real leadership role, beyond just being sort of a team leader, was 30 years ago this year. I was appointed as the chief executive and managing director of a small reinsurance brokerage headquartered in Sydney. I joined them a few years earlier to open their Melbourne office, so I knew the firm. And that was a company of around about 40 people at the time. It was fast growing, quite innovative, and very global in nature. A couple of years down the track, we made the decision to merge with a sister company who was part of the same international group but had very different reporting lines. And it was a very different kind of organization. And I think I understood immediately that the two cultures would be like trying to combine oil and water. The company that I'd been leading was focused on an area of the market that caused us to be very transactional, highly relationship driven, but again, very, very transactional. And the value that we brought was through the way we structured these transactions. So you can imagine sort of fast paced, very much a sales sort of orientation. The company we were merging with was much more, advice and service based, still very relationship driven, but value is measured over the course of a year, not over the course of the 2 weeks it might take to get a transaction completed. And so I realized pretty much immediately that these two cultures were going to clash. And that was, I think, one of the first sort of real leadership learnings for me, was actually to take time to understand the two cultures. I got somebody in to do what I called at the time a cultural audit of the two firms. And that body of work became a way of engaging the two separate teams and helping them understand each other's culture and to start to respect the value of that culture and why it was appropriate for the business that we were in. And that I think was a very important part of what led to a very seamless integration of two sort of equal-sized organisations. I think we created about a 100-person company out of that. So that was my first real people leadership role.
And I imagined some of the challenges there. You know, the thing I see often when people step into a leadership role, or even when they're in a team and they get promoted to that leadership, is they want to make their mark. They want to sort of put their stamp on it, is often the terms people use. And it sounds like instead of doing that, you sort of step back a little bit and thought, well, hang on, what's actually going on here, rather than, try and make one side like the other, or trying to create something different. But was there any resistance or challenges you faced in trying to do it through that approach?
Yes. Look, the transactional side of the organisation thought I was wasting my time. I think they thought, look, we're going to say essentially take over here. The side of the business that I was running was quite a bit more profitable and had quite a lot more market standing. And I think just to your way you framed the question, I think that is one of the challenges, if not mistakes, many leaders make, is they think about their stamp or their mark. Actually, a better way to think about it is helping the organisation find its own stamp and its own mark. It's less about you and what you're going to do to the organisation, but more about what you can do for the organisation to find its own way in the world. To create something that's quite meaningful, purposeful, and valuable both to its customers and to its own people.
Yeah, which is it's an important thing. It's a service orientation, isn't it? You're there to help the organisation, not there to make something for yourself out of it. Well, were there any big mistakes that you sort of come across during your early or any part of your leadership journey? I know we've all got some battle scars.
Yeah. Goodness gracious, how long have we got? Look, I think maybe I'll focus on a couple of mistakes that I actually struggled to learn from. In fact, I repeated them sort of quite often. One was, I think, having a naturally sort of, I'm going to say, nurturing side, and I'm probably flattering myself too much in using that description, but I was sort of very focused on what I could do for others, how I could help them improve, etc. And so sometimes it caused me to delay too long on making the hard people decisions. I think I sort of felt like, I can actually help this person become part of the team. I can help this person change, and to accept the fact that I couldn't felt like a bit of failure, and it felt like I was letting them down. And quite often it sent the wrong message to other staff members that I was tolerating, the continuance of these poor behaviours, etc. Whilst in my mind, I was actually trying to save this person. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't go down that path. I think I should have had a much clearer understanding of when I had to admit that we needed to move on. And so I did that numerous times through my career. And the very fact that I was able to recognise it, I think, sort of allowed me to try and at least arrest the temptation to continue to do that. The second thing that struck me very early in my sort of leadership journey was that because I had a natural desire for people to succeed, so when I would give them a significant task, it might be to run a division, create a new product, define a new market segment, I thought I was an effective delegator. I thought I was creating opportunity for them, which, I've come to believe is my personal purpose, is to create opportunities for people. But what I was doing is I was riding shotgun on them, and I would be checking in all the time. And they got to the stage where they almost felt immobilized. They'd continually come back and check with me, and then I'd wonder, why weren't they just getting on with it, right? Well, the issue was actually me. I was part of that problem. And so, again, these are habits or traits or characteristics formed by just, the layering of experiences on experiences, and they probably start deep in your childhood, right? So learning how to recognize them when they were going to emerge, you may not be able to sort of change them completely, but if you can recognize that this is a tendency I have and I have to be alert to it. Over the years, I've worked with a couple of people where I've had the kind of relationship where I could say to them, you know that I'm likely to do this. I need you to call me on it when you see it, because it may take me too long to recognize it. So I've got a litany of other mistakes that I've made, but those are probably the two that I found the most challenging to actually sort of deal with change.
Yeah, it's fascinating because often when I'm working with teams, the big things that are popping up at the moment are, one, around how do you make sure you do let some people leave. Some people have to move on and it's not right for them. And often the first thought people say is, well, hang on, the empathy guy is now talking about firing people. What happened here? But as you probably recognize, it's not empathetic to them if they're struggling, and it's not empathetic to your team if they're holding, the behaviours aren't aligning and holding people, accountable and getting those outcomes that we really need. So I think it's one of those sort of important things to do. And that second point, I love it, that whole, we create a reliance relationship. I often find busy leaders say, oh, my people are always checking in and, I've always getting questions. And my answer is usually, well, they keep asking questions because you keep giving them answers. And,
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's funny, but well, it's not funny. It should be concerning. But I think one of the learnings for me out of that sort of period of reflection, deep reflection, was that, when something doesn't go the way you thought it should have, a natural human reaction is to think, oh, if Bobby had done this differently, we would have had a different outcome. If Sally had turned up on, but actually the question you should start with is, what as a leader should I have done differently that might have changed that outcome? And it turns you from being sort of a victim into the architect of the solution, because it's going to start with you. If you're the leader, it's going to start with you. So, and I think it's, everyone talks about the shadow of leadership, and I suspect they do without really understanding what it means. But actually, it is a very powerful, it can be an insidious thing if you don't actually realize the impact that you're having. Every word you utter, every sideways glance, every action you take is sending a signal to the organization, and you have to be conscious of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to reflect on the outcomes and the impact rather than just the intent. Because as you were saying, your intent to nurture it's a good one, right? No one's going to say stop being nurturing, but the intent wasn't the challenge. It was the way that played out in the context of the organization.
Exactly.
Is there any piece of advice you wish that someone had sort of whispered in your ear early on that you might pass on to others now pretty frequently?
Yes. I mean, I'd start my response by saying I was very fortunate through my career. I always seem to be able to find people who, whilst I wouldn't say we necessarily had a formal mentor or coach relationship, they were prepared to spend time with me, and I learned. I think one of the things that I learned quite late in my career. In fact, I really probably only learned it in my last executive role, which is a sad thing because that's over 40 years. Is that as a new leader, particularly a new leader going into a big role, you often feel under pressure to move on things. Particularly if you've already been sitting in the organisation somewhere and you've been promoted. You've been sitting there observing some of the challenges or issues that you'd like to fix or like to solve, and there's you feel an expectation from those around you that now that you've got the job, you're going to get on with it. I think the real issue is that when you get into that role, the world looks very different. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as prepared as you think you are for that role, you're not. No one is. I sit in many sort of succession planning sort of meetings around board tables, and this expression "ready now" keeps coming up. Is he ready now, or is she ready now, or is she ready in 3 years' time? Well, actually, no one's ready now, right? You're never going to know until you put them into the job, right? And they become ready in the role. And so I think a learning that I had very late in my career was that you actually always do have more time, and you should take that time. You feel under pressure to make sort of fast, rapid decisions. And actually, oftentimes that can be the most destructive thing, because more often than not, you will wind up unwinding some of the things that you've done as your understanding and comprehension of the challenges and the opportunities improve from this new vantage point that you now have.
Yeah, and I think especially when there's, you do get promoted internally, because there's a whole bunch of people probably sitting around thinking, that probably could be me, or that should have been me, and this is what I would have done. And we all have that sort of natural, this is how I think it's going to play out. When you do get into a senior leadership role, and you've run some pretty big organizations, large sways of business, and also impact on the Australian community, what do you see when you sit in that sort of role? We go back to running IAG, CEO of IAG. What was your biggest sort of role? What would you see your job to be as sitting in that seat?
Well, it's pretty simple. I mean, I think it starts with an understanding that leadership can't exist without followership. And followership only exists if people feel that the leader is going to look after their interests. And in the business context, it means not only, but it certainly does mean that you will help find opportunities for them to grow, develop, and to be their very best. So I think for me that is the number one priority of leadership, is to recognize that you have an obligation to your people. And I think hand in glove with that, and I think it's becoming a little more visible today. I think it's always been an undercurrent, but it's becoming more, I guess, it's surfaced more, is this realization that people don't just come to work to pick up their wage and go home, right? And the delineation between work and play is very, very blurred. You might work an 8 till 6 day, but you'll be having a shower at 6 a.m. and something will run through your mind, right? And you don't let it go. You store that. But so we're always on in some ways, shape or form. And so I think companies that can provide meaning in the work that people do are companies that succeed. And I think that's where I think really good leaders shine is in being able to divine the organization's purpose. And as you know, Daniel, IAG very committed to its purpose of making your world a safer place. But it's an evolutionary process, and it started out as being a purpose that IAG checked all its decision making against. But it morphed over time, and there was a catalytic event which sort of, I guess, really accentuated that morphing. But it became what we're in business for. And so it wasn't simply a case of, does this make your world safer or unsafer? It was, what do we need to do to make your world a safer place? And that led to the redesign of a lot of our claims handling procedures. We realized that the 8 most terrifying minutes a customer had in lodging a claim was the 8 minutes on average they spent on hold waiting for the claims consultant to answer the phone, right? They didn't know how the company was going to respond. So all those kinds of things, right through to the products and services themselves, and particularly the services that we put around the products. So, and I think, I had a couple of cracks at trying to introduce purpose to organizations I'd led previously. And my reflection, having not been overly successful on those occasions, was that I'd actually imposed a purpose upon those companies. What I'd done is I'd craft essentially a marketing tagline which reflected what I wanted us to be, not what our people thought we were. And so the process at IAG was very different. We conducted, I think it was about 1,700 interviews, and asked a whole series of questions to try and sort of elicit from our people what they thought our purpose was. And it was seen most clearly through that claims window, which was essentially, by the time we took all the feedback and distilled it down into a set of words, it started off as, we help make your world a safer place. And in the end, I dropped the word help because I felt that created some optionality. It gave us an out. Well, we can't do it on our own. We're going to help you. Actually, you know what? Let's be accountable. Let's own that space on behalf of our customers and our people and the communities in which we live and work.
Yeah, it's as we both love insurance, it's such an important part of the society operating effectively. And from the outside, it can look, some things, I know many insurance companies can run as just numbers and spreadsheets, and actuaries can get very fascinated. And I think that focus on the claims is really important. I remember you telling a story of one of the things you did as a senior leader. You'd actually call people who had a bad experience, and you spoke to a gentleman about his claims experience. I don't know if you remember that particular call.
I do. I can't remember his name, but give me enough time and I might. Yeah, so we used to, as an executive team, but also as a board, we would occasionally from our own sort of desks, not that we had our own desks back then, but sometimes we'd also go out to one of the contact centres in Parramatta, and we would bring back detractors, people who would fill out the survey and basically said they weren't going to recommend us to anybody. And I think it was really important for the executive and for the directors to actually hear firsthand from customers how we were failing them. And the reason I was really keen for that is when you get investment decisions that come before the executive team or the board, you really need everybody who's contributing to that decision to understand the importance of what we need to do to improve our customer service. This particular chap, I rang him and I thanked him for completing the survey, and I apologised for the fact that we had disappointed him, that we hadn't met his expectations. And he said to me, "No, you have." He said, you exactly met my expectations. The behaviour, it wasn't his word, but the behaviour was exactly what I was expecting from an insurance company. And Like, it wasn't new news, but it was really confronting to actually hear that directly. That customer wasn't even disappointed. You know, he had expected to have trouble with his claim, and he got trouble with his claim. So it sort of met his expectation. I mean, that is a terribly confronting thing.
Mm. And it's really important, I think, and a really important thing for all leaders to think about. As you move up through an organization, you get further away from the action, further away from where things are actually happening, and yet you're making decisions that have a huge impact on this, the large bottom of the triangle, if you like, even though you're a long way away. So having that connection, I think, is a really important thing to do. And did you ever get resistance from people on, going and doing that?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I smile because you're used to the word triangle. Takes me back to when back in the very early part of 2000, and I took over the retail operations in Australia, New Zealand, North and South Pacific for Aon. And this was a company of 2,000 or 3,000 people. I hadn't quite turned 40 years of age, and I had an executive team where I think the next youngest member was about 55. So it was, and all male, right? Pretty challenging. And one day early on in my tenure, we were sitting around the management table having a conversation about something that needed to happen. I can't remember the subject. And I just thought, I don't even understand this conversation. And then suddenly it struck me that my mindset and the mindset of almost everyone else around the table were just completely different. So I said to one of these fellows, who subsequently I've called him an old crusty. I'm probably now the old crusty, right? But I said to this fellow, listen, here's a whiteboard marker. If I asked you to draw the organisation as a shape, as a geometric shape, how would you draw it? And he looked at me as though, you've got to be crazy. I'm not going to do this. And I said, come on. Anyway, got up and he drew the triangle, which is what I expected, right? So I said, where are we? And he drew a circle around the apex, right? And then I said, where are our people? And he drew a line across the bottom. And I said, okay, this is the fundamental cause of the problem that we have in this conversation. And so I drew the triangle up the other way. And I said, yes, we're at the apex, but the apex is at the bottom. And up here are all our people who are interfacing with our customers every day. And our job is not to tell them what to do, right? Our job is to listen to what they need from us to do what they know they have to do to meet the needs of our customers. And our job is to get the processes and the crap that stops them doing their job out of their way. Anyway, that leadership team and I parted company, and we moved on. Actually, that's not fair. There was a very sort of natural turnover, and there were a couple of those management members who went the journey with me, and I was very grateful for that, because having that kind of continuity is really, really helpful.
Yeah, look, it is. I remember working with a HR team in a past life, and them telling me that the business needs to do this and the business needs to do that. And I said, hang on, do you realize you guys don't make any money? None of the money gets made here. We're here to serve the business, to serve those people who do the hard work. So it's a really important theme that sort of keeps coming up, this idea of serving. Sorry, go, yeah.
I think, that's something else that's really, really important, is that everybody in an organization is serving, right? And so one of the roles that senior leadership needs to play is to show everyone in the company how their role impacts positively or negatively, like how they do their role impacts positively or negatively on the customer experience. So you could be in accounts payable, but someone needs to help you see the trail all the way through to how what you're doing impacts the customer. And I think if you can do that, you've got a better chance of getting alignment and better chance of scrubbing out those kinds of conversations that you just described.
Yeah, I remember Ralph Norris at CBA once challenged everyone that, we're here to look after customers, and people in the back office said, well, we don't talk to customers. We've got nothing to do with customers. And he said, if you don't have anything to do with customers, why are you here?
Yeah,
we are here to do. Is there some sort of a common issue? You're on boards now, obviously, and you're working with a lot of people in the modern sort of leadership space, and there's a lot's changed in the last couple of years through the pandemic and through all the challenges that we're sort of facing at the moment. Are there some emerging challenges you're seeing, or some things you're seeing people struggle with at the moment in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of these things have been building for a while, but perhaps they've been brought into sharper focus as a consequence of what we've been through, both the challenges and the opportunities presented by COVID. But I think, and you're going to laugh, I think this is an old person's view, to be honest, but I think, if I go back to sort of what I would describe as my generation, coming out of the recession of the 60s, life was quite different to what it is today. And a lot more of the focus was on job security. It was on making sure that you could meet your commitments in terms of mortgage or rent or put food on the table. And so that generation of baby boomers and sort of the first part of the next generation, I think they're getting to a stage now where everyone's thinking about, well, okay, we've done okay. The economy sort of globally and domestically has been pretty good, like over that period of time. And now we've got this, we've never been more wealthy. I mean, there's a lot of inequity around the world and there's a lot of poverty. And I'm not trying to sort of downplay that at all, but we have in the last 10 years taken 1 billion people out of poverty around the world. So generally, it may not feel like that it's a consistent pathway, but generally living standards are improving. We're now at a stage where everyone talks about this unprecedented generational wealth transfer, right? And so I wonder to what extent that has an impact on the mindset of people. And I think in some ways it's good because it liberates people. It actually detaches them from, the bottom layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and allows them to sort of think a little bit sort of broader. So what we've got now are generations of people who are thinking a lot about their impact on the world. They're thinking about a lot about what they can do for society, and they're looking for alignment with their friends that they have either in the real world or in the virtual world, in the social media world, but also for the companies that they work for or even work with. And I think there's something very powerful and positive about that, but it becomes incumbent on leaders and particularly CEOs to be able to position their organization as one that is purposeful, that is actually making a societal contribution that is positive. And I think a lot of leadership teams are really struggling with, what that is, and how to make whatever it is actually noble and attractive to employees, particularly sort of new recruits. And then I think the distributed working model, which has brought so many benefits to so many people, actually exacerbates that challenge because it creates difficulties in connection, and we haven't sophisticated technology yet to the point where we can completely obviate the positive impact of a face-to-face connection. We can augment it with technology, we can maintain things with technology, but we haven't got to the stage yet where we can build anew. And so I think that's a challenge that I see lots of executive leadership teams sort of wrestling with at the moment is, firstly, how to ensure that everyone sees the meaning in what they do. How do we ensure that has an external focus as well as an internal focus? And then how do we build that alignment in a distributed working model? I think it's quite challenging.
Yeah, it's there's a psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, and he describes our brains as having two parts, an elephant with a little man sitting on his back. And the man sitting on his back is our logical, rational, conscious brain, and the elephant is the subconscious, your very instinctive and emotive brain. And I think, as you described it, what was coming to mind is that the elephant wants to make sure it means something. The elephant wants to belong somewhere. The elephant wants to feel like this is, a safe place where I feel I'm part of it. It's something that's more meaningful. And I think one thing that technology really plays to is it plays to the writer. It says, well, work can be done from anywhere. There's just tasks. And we break work down into very logical sort of chunks and pieces, and it all makes sense. But it doesn't feed the elephant, does it? It doesn't sort of feed that subconscious need we have. And that's a real challenge. It's something that leaders need to understand. And often the most intelligent people I see sometimes, the smartest sort of actuarial and logically minded people really miss that whole purpose and connection side of things that I think you did a great job of building at IAG.
I mean, I think I was very fortunate at IAG. If you think about the two main halves of the company, and I'm not being fair to the other parts of the organisation, but one was the NRMA, which came out of a mutual. So we were owned by our policyholders, right? That creates a very different mindset about your customer. It creates a very different mindset about profitability, which also brings its challenges. And then CGU had, its heartland was sort of rural and regional Australia, where there's a deep, the farm gate kind of connection. So I think I was very fortunate. I was sort of working with very, very, people who are already on that pathway.
Yes, although it's very easy for it to go in many different ways, and there's a lot of organisations around the world that have sort of come from those beginnings and head off in different directions. So I admire you saying it was easier, but I think it also takes a lot of courage in some ways to step into that space. Is there something you really you look back on at IAG that you're really proud of achieving with the group there?
Oh, I mean, yes, I would say the most important thing that was achieved at IAG during my tenure was this. I think sustainable commitment to purpose. And it came from the board down. I mean, I haven't had a conversation with the IAG board about an investment in something that was going to help us deliver on our purpose that went the wrong way. So you can't deliver this only as a management team. There has to be alignment from the chairman right through the organisation. So I sort of feel that things will wax and wane in all organisations, but I feel like that's a legacy of those years. It's not my legacy, but it's a legacy of those years that I think is really, really important. And I think at a more granular level, there are other things like the build out of the Human-Centred Design Academy and just the sort of infiltration of HCD thinking that's right across that organisation. It just forces people to think customer impact, observe the behaviour. I would hope that that's sustainable as well. So.
Yeah, fantastic. Peter, is there someone you admire when you think of a leader, someone that stands out for you, or maybe a couple of people?
Yeah. There are two people who I feel have been really influential in my own journey, and they are quite different people, and in a business context at opposite ends of the spectrum. And the first was a lady by the name of Rosemary Howell, who ran a very small boutique consulting company called Strategic Consulting. And she was a lawyer and barrister by trade. And she was the lady that I had to come in to do the cultural audit of the two firms that I merged in the early to mid-90s. And I retained her on an annual basis for the next couple of years just to have a conversation with her. I mean, I'm sure she would have done it for nothing, but I didn't feel like I'd ask her to come in once a month and sit with me for an hour or two, right? And what I observed early on in my working with Rosemary is Rosemary never told me anything. She just kept asking the most uncomfortable questions. And it was a huge lesson for me. It was a masterclass in how to actually help someone find a different way of thinking about challenges, about problems, about potential solutions. And then the second person who was really impactful for me is a guy called Greg Case, who is still the CEO of Aon. He was appointed in about 2005, so he's a very, very long-serving CEO, particularly in the American context. He's headquartered in Chicago. And Greg came into a global organisation that had been built very, very quickly through mergers and acquisitions. I worked for that company for 23 years. I think it's fair to say at that stage it was highly dysfunctional as a global company. And Greg had been the global leader for the financial services practice for McKinsey. Mm-hmm. And I think when he came into the company, he felt, having worked as a consultant for the company, he knew the company quite well. I think once he got on the inside, I think he was probably quite horrified at what he found with the politics on a local, regional, and global level. That was how I got to take on the role in the UK, as I think Greg just felt like he needed some new blood, but people who knew the company. And Greg set up right from the get-go, long before he had established what his plan was going to be, what his agenda was going to be, he set up a narrative around the company focusing on three things. One was about the customers, two was about efficiency, And then the third was about how we're going to work together. Now, the lesson for me was, what company says we want to screw our customers over, we want to be as inefficient as possible, and we don't care about our people? Right? I mean, that may be the outcome sometimes, but no one goes in saying those things, right? So in a way, they were very generic statements. But what they allowed him to do was, as his knowledge of what needed to be done deepened, and as he talked to more people and more of the answers started to emerge, he was able to actually build the granularity onto those three pillars. So it looked like it was just completely consistent from the first day, the first month of his appointment. Greg was one of the best, certainly one of the cleverest people I've ever worked with, but one of the best listeners. And he was a man who worked phenomenal hours, but he always had time for you. You never felt that you were under any time pressure. So he absorbed all of that. So if you needed more time, he would give it to you. It just meant that it put more pressure on him. But one of his favorite sayings, and I've appropriated it, is one of the many roles of leadership is to create calm out of the chaos. And I watched him do that time and time again. And I can tell you now, I spent 3 years or 2.5 years in the trenches of a multi-jurisdictional bribery and corruption case that I discovered when I first got to London. It was quite a traumatic time, but I always knew that I was very lucky to have someone like Greg Case in the trenches with me going through that.
Yeah, and then sometimes that's the most important role a leader can play, is to help people just feel safe, feel that sense of calmness that we're going to get through, and we're not alone in those sorts of situations.
Well, I think it's physiological or neurological. You'll be able to tell me, I'm sure, but when you're stressed, your brain cycles are cycling at whatever it is, 32, whatever, I can't remember, and you don't make good decisions. Right? So the calmer you are, if you can just control your breathing and start to slow down your heart rate and your brain cycles per second, it's like when you go for a run and you get into that sort of, it's almost cathartic, right? You're almost meditating, and suddenly answers, once you get through the first 5 minutes and the pain disappears, right? It's sort of like the answers to problems that you've been wrestling with for hours or days suddenly pop into your mind, right? It's because you've just calmed yourself. And so I think really good leaders are very adept at bringing calm to tense situations, because that's when people do their best thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the really good research on anxiety creating pessimism and catastrophizing. And I think we've all, I'm sure, I know I have, I'm sure we've all been through that cycle. We could recognize, I often say to people, if you're in that state, what you'll notice is you seem to get a lot of red lights. And, every time you drive, you get red lights. And my antidote is, when you go through a green light, just say yes. Because what you don't realize is there's lots of green lights. You get them all the time. You just ignore them, and there's lots of positives that we sort of dismiss too quickly, I think, in the world. Peter, look, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. There's so much I'll take away from this conversation, and I really thank you for making the time to have a chat with me this morning.
It's been a great pleasure, Daniel, and great to catch up with you again. All the best.